The city of Constantinople was in an uproar. John Chrysostom, the beloved archbishop, had been banished from the imperial capital on orders from the Emperor Arcadius himself. Throngs of John's supporters crowded the streets, protesting the injustice and demanding their spiritual leader's return. But the palace guards held firm, preventing any from leaving the city to join John in exile. Among the angry crowd was Marcus, a young man who had found renewed faith and purpose under John's teaching. As a former pagan with a checkered past, Marcus saw in John a reflection of God's power to transform lives. He could not bear the thought of losing his mentor and guide. "It's a disgrace," Marcus shouted to those around him. "Bishop John spoke only the truth, and this is how they repay him? By casting him out like a criminal." "The Empress Eudoxia couldn't handle the truth," spat an old woman named Irene. "That Jezebel condemned a holy man because he dared chastise her vanity and excesses." Marcus nodded grimly. He had heard how John's fiery sermons denouncing the lavish lifestyles of the rich and powerful had earned him dangerous enemies at court, especially the vengeful empress. But the people had loved John all the more for his courage in speaking out against injustice. As the mob's anger reached a fever pitch, Marcus knew rioting would solve nothing. John himself preached peace and obedience to authority, however corrupt it might be. Slipping away from the crowd, Marcus hurried to the city docks. He had to find a way to reach John in his place of exile and let him know he was not forgotten. Fortunately, Marcus still had contacts among the rough sea traders from his bygone days carousing in dockside taverns. For a few silver coins, he secured discreet passage on a small vessel carrying goods up the coast. As the ship left the Golden Horn and caught the wind in its sails, Marcus prayed he would find John before it was too late. After several uneventful but anxious days at sea, the ship put in at the Black Sea port of Dioscorus. From there, Marcus set out on foot, following the faint trail of rumors about the exiled archbishop's whereabouts. He journeyed for 2 more grueling weeks, begging shelter from simple villagers and keeping a wary eye out for imperial spies or informants. At last, exhausted and filthy, Marcus arrived at the remote monastery where John had been confined. A group of monks warily greeted him at the gate, unsure whether to trust this wild-eyed young stranger. But when Marcus explained his connection to John and his church in Constantinople, they welcomed him as a brother. They took Marcus to a small, spare cell where he found John hunched over a writing table, his face more gaunt and careworn than Marcus remembered. But when the bishop looked up and saw his young friend, the years and burdens seemed to lift away. "My dear Marcus," John exclaimed, rising to embrace him. "God be praised for your safe journey. But what madness brought you to this forsaken place? You should be at home serving the faithful." "I could never abandon you, Father," Marcus said, fighting back tears. "The people have not forgotten you. Even now they cry out for your return." John smiled sadly. "Would that it were so. But I fear my fate is sealed. The Empress and my enemies at court will never allow me to retake my rightful place. At least here I can continue my life's work of prayer, writing and teaching, albeit on a much reduced scale." He gestured to the tiny cell. Marcus's heart broke to see his once dynamic leader so resigned to his unjust fate. "There must be something we can do, some way to appeal the emperor's decree. Many still support you, if we rally them." But John cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No, I'll not have you endangering yourself or inciting unrest on my behalf. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. We must trust in God's plan, however mysterious it may seem." Recognizing the finality in John's voice, Marcus had no choice but to obey. He stayed on at the monastery for several more weeks, recording John's teachings, praying together, and reminiscing about happier days. The monks' austere but peaceful existence was a balm to Marcus's own troubled soul. However, their brief respite was not to last. One gray dawn, imperial soldiers arrived to transfer John to a new place of exile even further removed. Marcus watched helplessly as his friend and mentor was led away in chains, a reverse image of Christ's last journey. Knowing any attempt to interfere would only make matters worse, Marcus could only commend John unto God's keeping. Heavy of heart, Marcus slowly made his way back to Constantinople. He dreaded bearing the news of John's worsened condition to the brethren there. But to his surprise, he found the archbishop's allies regrouping and devising a strategy to press for his release and reinstatement. Key bishops and laymen wrote letters to the Emperor Arcadius and his co-emperor Honorius in the west, appealing for a council to examine the legality of John's deposition and exile. When their petitions went unanswered, some even traveled to Rome to beseech the support of Pope Innocent I, who sent a strongly worded condemnation of the affair back to Constantinople. Still, the emperor, controlled by his wife and advisors, refused to relent. But neither did John's defenders give up their quest. Marcus threw himself into the efforts, helping to raise funds for John's monastic prison, carrying messages between the conspirators, always keeping his ear to the ground for any news. Months dragged into years with no change in the impasse. The Eastern and Western churches were on the brink of schism over John Chrysostom's treatment. Finally, in a desperate gambit, John's allies proposed a dramatic demonstration of spiritual power and popular support. On Easter Sunday, 404 AD, vast crowds of the faithful thronged the public squares and thoroughfares of Constantinople. At a prearranged signal, they began loudly chanting prayers and hymns associated with their exiled archbishop. The people's devotion was undeniable. For a moment, it seemed the demonstration might turn the tide. But then disaster struck. A sudden earthquake rocked the city, toppling statues and damaging buildings. The Empress Eudoxia promptly declared it a sign of divine wrath against John and his rebellious followers. New orders were dispatched to clamp down even harder on the Johannites. Soldiers stormed their churches, arrested their leaders, and broke up their clandestine prayer gatherings. Those who refused to repudiate John were tortured or exiled themselves. Marcus was among those arrested and imprisoned. As he languished in his dank underground cell, Marcus despaired that all was lost. He had failed his friend and mentor. The church was more divided than ever, and now his own life might be forfeit for a seemingly hopeless cause. But even at his lowest ebb, Marcus clung to his faith. He remembered John's example of perseverance in the face of adversity, and he drew strength from the knowledge that whatever happened to him, the truth of Christ and his church would endure. Marcus lost track of the days and nights, sustained only by meager prison rations and occasional whispered reports from sympathetic guards. Then one momentous day, he was hauled from his cell, blinking against the unaccustomed daylight. Fearing he faced a harsh interrogation or worse, he steeled himself, only to be shocked when his captors removed his chains. "You're free to go," the guard captain informed him gruffly. "The emperor is dead. The empress is in exile herself, and a general amnesty has been declared for all the Johannites." Still reeling from this sudden reversal, Marcus stumbled out into the streets which were abuzz with the news. Against all odds, it seemed God had heard the prayers of the faithful. John's allies lost no time capitalizing on the palace coup to press their case. Citing the instability of the empire and the need for unity, the new imperial administration agreed to allow John's return as a symbolic gesture. But it was too late. Even as his supporters celebrated, word reached the capital that John Chrysostom had died in exile, his health broken by years of deprivation and mistreatment. Marcus was devastated by the news. His joyous homecoming turned to ashes. For days he mourned, awash in grief and regret. If only he had done more, risked more, perhaps he could have saved his friend. But then, in the midst of his sorrow, a strange sense of peace began to steal over him. He realized that John's legacy was never dependent on his physical presence. The archbishop's words, his teachings, his example of Christ-like love and sacrifice, lived on in the hearts of all those he had touched, including Marcus himself. With newfound resolve, Marcus threw himself into the tasks of rebuilding and reconciliation. There was much work to be done in knitting the frayed church back together. And now more than ever, the people needed shepherds to proclaim the gospel of grace and lead them through the uncertain times ahead. Drawing on all that John had taught him, Marcus devoted himself to preaching, teaching, and ministering to the least and the lost. He carried the light of Christ into the darkest corners of Constantinople, just as John had done. In time, he took up the mantle of leadership, humbly accepting ordination and responsibility for the very flock once entrusted to John. Through long years of service, Marcus never wavered in his commitment to the truth and to the people in his care. Empires might rise and fall, prelates and princes might come and go, but the church endured, sometimes underground, sometimes in open triumph. And through it all, Marcus clung to the words of his mentor. We must obey God rather than man. He will never leave us nor forsake us, even to the end of the age.